Black Myth Wukong is a game that at its best is an outstanding achievement. A product of care and detail in crafting a journey that when you're battling it out in its most spectacular arenas against its most impressive foes, reaches heights rarely reached. A stunning show of spectacle backed by solid systems that are creatively used throughout the entire game to create boss fights that are consistently a joy to navigate. But while that describes it at its best, there's also a different side to the same coin. And while there's nothing here to the opposite end of the spectrum, there's no moment that felt terrible, there were dozens and dozens of moments where it ranged from annoying to frustrating to baffling. There are many little problems sprinkled throughout the game, from jank to hitboxes to performance stutters during critical boss fights, the camera not knowing what to do with itself, some of the level design being a cruel joke, and especially outside of bosses, the encounter design for normal enemies can become boring and later on, like a repeat of Lords of the Fallen. Despite these persistent issues, I found myself enjoying my time with the game and compelled to finish it. And upon finishing it, I was left with a game that I greatly respect, and one which I personally greatly enjoyed. It helps that it puts a special focus onto some gaming concepts that I absolutely love, and I made an entire separate video on how I can like a game this much and still have so many criticisms of it. And I want you to know that I absolutely love many things that this game does. But maybe because of that, I also couldn't stop myself from thinking how much better this game could be with just some of the smallest tweaks. Because if there's one thing that Wukong fails at that hinders the game throughout, it's consistency. The game is in a limbo of not being fully action nor RPG, the two things it bills itself as, and this can cause issues. Its level design fluctuates between overly simple hallways and difficult to discern mazes of similar looking environments. Its boss fights, while frequently fantastic, do have occasions with enemies that are way too simple and enemies that are overly annoying in their design and rely heavily on minigames and puzzles that ruin the flow of combat if you aren't aware of how to counter them. But it does offer rewarding ways to overcome those obstacles for those looking for it. And within all of that, all of the negatives I just said, the way that it weaves its gameplay loop, its story, its progression, and its encounters kept me having a fantastic time. And that's how I knew this was a game I wanted to talk about in depth, because that's an interesting combination that deserves to be explored. So welcome, I'm Mug. I hope you'll join me in exploring a game that, for me, might be a masterpiece, but the most flawed one I've ever played. This video will contain minor spoilers for everything throughout the beginning of Chapter 5, but I've made sure to avoid specific callouts so that you can listen to this video and still understand what I'm talking about. And there will be a spoiler section towards the end of the video that I'll give you warning of. Timestamps for everything are down below. And I want to let you know that videos like this one take a very long time to make, and it's thanks to your support when watching them that I can do them. But it's also thanks to our fantastic sponsors. And today I have one that has actually very much impacted my life. Aha! Sorry to interrupt the video, but I've come to talk to you about something really important that has actually changed the way that I make my videos. And that's today's sponsor, eMeet, and their new S800 webcam. eMeet specializes in webcams that are solutions for your meetings, your recording, and your streaming. And they sent over their new S800, a webcam that goes up to 4K at 30 FPS, or 1080p at 60 FPS if you wanted to do that, with ultra-fast autofocus, 2 noise-canceling microphones, all supported by a 1/2-inch Sony sensor. And actually, the last 4 videos that I've put up on the channel have been made using this webcam. I haven't been using it in 4K though, so now you can see every single imperfection of me right here, big on your screen. Thanks for that, eMeet. But that is precisely the reason that I can recommend it, especially from my perspective. It's a camera that performs much better in low-light situations, which is something that cameras in the same price range struggle with a lot and use a lot of low-light compensation techniques that make videos look choppy. But with this one, I don't have to worry as much and I can make the lighting in my videos look a lot more natural, and it's much more useful for streaming where I don't always have optimal lighting conditions. It's also a much better camera to position and get the right angle. The point is, I can recommend it because it's what I use. And when I say competitively priced, I mean that you can buy this camera for $120, or using the coupon code that you can find in the description below or in the comments, you can get it for $10 off. And that would have been the ideal purchase for me if I had known this camera existed when I first went shopping for a webcam. You can check out more details on the eMeet S800 at the website using the link down below, and it lets them know that I sent you, which is also good for the channel. Thank you for watching this video sponsor, and thanks eMeet for sponsoring it and for being the camera that I actually use now. Back to the video. I've noticed that when I sit down to do reviews, I tend to start off with the negative. So I want to do things differently today, because there's a lot of good to praise. So I want to start there, and then move on to the things that should be improved, and then the things that are outright unacceptable. If you're looking for a review on if you should buy this game, well, I do think it's a Game of the Year contender. And I think that if you like the recent God of Wars and maybe a bit more Souls-like in them, as well as maybe appreciating some of the spectacle of Asura's Wrath, you'll enjoy or even love this game. It is, however, a bit difficult, more or less, depending on your choices for builds, and if those things that I mentioned don't immediately vibe with you, maybe steer clear or wait for a sale. It's a great experience, but due to its genre and difficulty, I don't think it's a must-play for everyone. I mean, it isn't Yoshi's Story on N64, but what is? Monkey May Cry is a fairly linear game in which you overcome different levels and take on a huge number of bosses with a very satisfying combat system, all set in the very unique fantasy of Chinese mythology, centered on Journey to the West, the very important novel that tells the story of Sun Wukong. In this case, telling the story of the Destined One after the events of the book. Within this unique setting, Wukong plays out like a highly enjoyable action-adventure game, over 6 chapters filled with surprises, over 30 or so hours. A fair bit more if you're hunting for secrets, or depending on your skill at handling the bosses, all as you collect a series of relics to resurrect Sun Wukong. Some of the best parts of Monkey Kills Gods comes from how much has been done to make the experience smooth for players and like a roller coaster ride. It has issues with pacing that we'll cover later, but the intention is clearly for it to be a smooth ride all the way through, with no mandatory grinding or spots of frustration beyond the boss difficulty. It's very much a level-based game, focused on combat, and the combat, while having a lot of jank, never demands insane precision, making it more forgivable. There's many ways to offset the potential difficulty with magic and different upgrades and stats, and its overall difficulty is well-tuned, even when the frustrating jank is taken into account. And it features a ton of progression systems, from weapons to armor to skills to spirits to your healing gourd, which is like an Estus flask, and even consumables, that allow players to find and power up their preferred playstyle, and in doing so, make even the slightly more difficult fights much easier. And the progression of it all is very clear, with endgame gear being the best overall. Because of all of this, it moves at a breezy clip, often keeping a tight pacing of visually exciting bosses that never really leaves you room to stop. And even in my favorite part about the game, which is the bonkers amount of secrets and hidden side quests to explore, that pacing of bosses stays the same, but just now in optional or secret areas where you are left in control of that pacing. With the game using a system similar to Dark Souls bonfires or checkpoints, you can change out your spells, you can fast travel, and the experience system here rewards skill points for the different skill trees that can be reallocated practically at any point from a bonfire. It also does an excellent job at making those secrets worthwhile. Not only do they contain cool locations and bosses, but the game will reward the player with outright overpowered abilities for when you receive them, or armor sets that at their worst are visually cool and have unique modifiers to them. This means that during your entire playthrough, odds are you'll be constantly entertained and feeling good about every step you take, be that on the main path or taking the time to thoroughly find its secrets. I frequently say that when a developer puts effort into content that many, maybe even the majority of the players can completely miss, you know that they have a passion for what they're making. And Wukong just might be one of the biggest examples of this. There are too many unique secret areas and bosses to count, including some of the best fights in the game. And these are very easy to miss for reasons we'll discuss later, and that passion from the team shines through in the other largest boon for the game. Its setting is wonderful. I have issues with the levels and how each chapter is structured, but hot dang is it not refreshing to see something of this scope and production quality depicting something that we rarely see, as is Chinese mythology. Even if you know nothing about it, which I personally had a very limited knowledge coming into the game, it's all so beautiful and interesting. From the designs of monsters to the photography, the composition of shots, the absolute care put into each chapter-ending cutscene, and the beautiful ballet of choreography put into both general combat and its cinematics. For as much as Monkey of War can be a looker for its use of Unreal Engine 5, its true magic is in the keen eye for photography and artistic sensibilities. When I saw the Chapter 3 beginning cutscene, I knew this game was made by people who wanted to make this game and have it shine, and I felt lucky that it was being shared with me. Now, I don't want to start with comparisons just yet, so let's start laying out all the things you have access to before we begin with that. The Destined one has access to one weapon, a staff, with 3 different stances, as well as 4 assignable spells that use mana and go on cooldown. You also have Chi, which allows for the use of transformations in your combos. You'll spot enemies that glow blue, and taking them down allows you to absorb their essence and equip the spirit, and pressing both triggers will transform you into that enemy to do an attack, which you need to refill your Chi to use again. This is, by the way, a nod to Wukong's 72 transformations. But you have another type of transformation as well. The spell versions of transformations will turn you into a fully controllable version of an enemy, with their own small set of attacks and special moves, and during this more complete transformation you have a completely new life bar, meaning that they are very powerful both offensively and defensively, and a great strategy for the people who are maybe struggling a bit with the game. On top of that, you also have vessels, which are very powerful items. There are 4 to choose from at the end of the game, and they also use Chi, the resource that you regain by attacking. And these can turn the tide of a fight, and some of them are very important at the end of the game. The core combat, regardless of the stance that you choose to use with your staff, is about offense. This is a very aggressively minded game where offense is heavily rewarded. Attacking fills up your focus points, and the more focus you have, the better. There's no blocking in the game, but perfect dodges and using perfectly timed heavy attacks ignore the enemy's attacks and help you build up more and more focus, leading up to you unleashing a devastating attack that will stagger enemies and deal big damage depending on how many points you have. At the core of everything is this constant build-up and spending of your focus points, and within this central loop is the use of everything else. From spells that immobilize the opponent or spells that allow you to dodge or parry an attack, your transformations, your vessels, your consumables, these are all managed carefully as you continue to build up focus, spend it, and repeat, with the variables being the different attack patterns of enemies that you must learn and what options you have available to aid you at any given time. It's a very satisfying system with a loop that's addictive. Landing your heavy attack is always a treat as enemies go flying and stagger, and overall the reactivity of enemies in fights communicates the power levels on which you and your opponents are on as the game progresses. This is the type of game where you can enter a flow state as you learn to cycle through all of your spells and options as you go. The long list of progression systems I mentioned before are there to better define what parts of this system you enjoy more, meaning that you can equip weapons or armor that complement more use of spells or more use of perfect dodges or counter hitting or even your spirits. And since pretty much each part of this can be upgraded, you can use your skill points on level up to focus more on just smacking the enemies with your staff or on powering up and extending the duration of things. And by now I think you see where this is headed. Even if there isn't infinite freedom here and you will always have to participate in the core combat loop, you can specialize more towards the way you want to play. And it's one of the best parts of Wukong's design, that it does contain a lot of choice despite having very limited systems that also keep the combat very calculated. And it had to be this good, because this system carries everything in the game on its back. And it manages to do so while still offering variety. When you're not fighting things, you are simply walking from point A to B. There is hardly any platforming, and when there is, it's very safe, with each area that you can walk on having barriers to prevent you from falling, except a few times. Puzzle solving and questing is primarily going to a location, talking to somebody, and then paying attention so that you know where to go next, with the only other obstacle really being enemies. What I'm getting at is that this game does one thing, and it wraps everything else around it. And that's really impressive to me. I know that when I remember my time with the game, it feels like I did a lot more than just fight and run towards places, and I imagine that's the case for more of you out there. But really, that's all we did. And the secret to keeping the game fresh for its entire runtime is not only the different locations or all the little nuggets of progression that can change your playstyle, but the huge number of enemies you fight, and how each of them makes you engage differently with combat. Aside from some of the mobs. Okay, most of the mobs. But bosses especially aren't just different in their timings or patterns, but in how you should exploit their weaknesses. With a lot of the easier ones, it can be hard to notice since they're dead, but the enemies here can be very different in how you're meant to approach them. And they accomplish that by doing a lot of stuff that I normally hate. And while I don't love it all the time here, I do respect it. I'm talking about certain patterns that out of context can be very obnoxious. There are bosses that will become invulnerable and force you to dodge and not interact with them, until you learn that they have a window before beginning these attacks where they can be interrupted, skipping the whole ordeal. There's bosses that will attack you 7 or 8 times in a row with very off timing, so if you had fun with Radahn in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, get ready for that here much earlier. And during that attack pattern, it feels like you can't get any damage in. And they also tend to end some of those combos by covering their escape and retreating. So it seems like there's no opening, but then you start to learn that you can abuse other options. Be that the long reach of the thrusting stance and building up focus through your perfect dodges, or weaving in attacks just enough to get out a finisher that can interrupt them, or just straight up using spells or transformations that interrupt them and place you back on the offensive, including things like the white transformation, which is a very heavy attack that will almost always completely stagger an enemy out of whatever they're doing. And this does mean that once you start playing this game on its own terms, a lot of fights become fairly simple but still very exciting, as you use your parry spell into a combo, into perfect dodges, into freezing the opponent and unleashing a heavy attack as you keep the foot on the gas to constantly dictate the terms of the fight. And if you ever screw up, regaining balance on the defensive and hunting for the opportunity to take control again. So for as much as it uses things I normally despise in the design of its bosses, and I can still sometimes hate them, it gives you tools to counter all of these, and it feels all the more rewarding for it. Fans of the channel might know how much I dislike the recent Elden Ring expansion for relying on bosses that were designed as these beasts that are impossibly strong, that force you on the defensive, and even similarly to Wukong, force you into mini-games where you can't even damage them. But Wukong takes advantage of its much more limited options. It's a game where the 15 or so main tools at the player's disposal, with 6 of them being equipped at all times, exist to make sure that these bosses whose designs I normally hate always have options for those willing to engage with its mechanics. You can always skip, interrupt, and sometimes intentionally, through some of the more puzzle-like interactions, break a lot of the bosses, and it always feels satisfying to nail a perfect run through them where you interrupt every attack that you hate, reducing a battle that you've been stuck on for 30 minutes into an attempt that lasted less than a minute. In this way, the game gives you access to all of these tools, and you have your 6 equipped tools with different customization options for each slot. On top of that, you have your stances, and with this at the core of the game, everything else that comes from it are the never-ending onslaught of brilliantly creative bosses that follow. Most of them will have patterns or characteristics that will make them immune to something, or that will make them much more vulnerable to something else. And it's up to the player to navigate the combat system and find what is the best way to take down each boss, frequently having multiple different options so that people don't feel like every boss is just an opportunity to go back to a shrine and respec into the best way possible, kind of forcing you into a puzzle-like solution that then requires combat levels of execution. It frequently plays around with its mechanics by having enemies that are very difficult to reach and that you want to stagger for long periods of time in a row, or enemies that, precisely because they are very difficult to reach, once staggered, once you figure out the trick, will give you very big openings for damage. It'll present enemies that are immune to basic attacks, or that are immune to some of your more crutch elements of magic. And so each battle is a combination of figuring out which tools work best at which moment during the fight, and it can sometimes feel like you're scripting the perfect choreography of it. This is helped by the fact that most bosses here are highly predictable. Entering an arena will frequently have them do the same sequence of attacks in a row, meaning that memorizing them can be pretty easy. So very often the first step of a fight is getting familiar with that moveset and then adapting to it. Be that by perfectly dodging everything and finding the most obvious openings, or by carefully examining what a boss does and how they react to different things at different points during each of their moves, so that you find openings and exploit them using more creative ways. Especially on the tougher enemies towards the end of the game, I found myself repeating fights over and over again, looking for that perfect run, where I had every spell ready for every specific attack that I wanted to interrupt, boiling the game down to a science. But the entire process of reaching that point of perfection in a fight was intensely rewarding all throughout. From the moment that you spot the boss, you're amazed at its design, you're trying to decipher the different moves that it's using and how to use your own. And I know that I've mentioned this in a couple of reviews before, but this is definitely a game where I'm very excited to see speedruns of it, since this choreography element of it will definitely show up there. And this is just a natural byproduct of the decisions made, the different tools that the player has access to, and how each boss has been carefully considered in how they will react to them, along with the very important decision of making these bosses highly predictable and consistent in their reactions to certain moves, meaning that the exploration of them is an absolute joy. Except when they have a run to them. When you have to run back to a boss every time you die in this game, it's very annoying, because if you're doing the method I'm saying and you're kind of trying to make choreography for the entire fight, then as soon as you're off of the choreography and have to improvise, it can feel a little lost, but it can also lead to some pretty clutch and very exciting moments, which normally is what's going to happen on your winning attempt, as you come closer and closer to the end of the fight and you don't have a script ready for it. And there, in that final hit against an enemy, this game provides a satisfaction that I had not felt in a very long time when it comes to the actual joy of overcoming a difficult enemy through a process that I thoroughly enjoyed every single time. And it all comes down to the different tools and how they're managed. This does come with a pretty huge problem, however. For as many things as I listed before and all the tools at your disposal, there are very much big cooldowns in one way or another, and using all of your cooldowns as an optimal sequence with precise executions is something that I like very much, and it places agency on the players. And all of that works wonders as a system for boss fights, where every retry gives you access to your entire suite of cooldowns again. But when fighting mobs, not so much. Many of these cooldowns are overkill for most mobs, and given you can charge your focus at any time by holding heavy attack, you could charge before you aggro an enemy and just one-shot most mobs. That charge mechanic in boss fights can be slipped in very carefully and is sometimes required for certain boss mechanics, but bosses always read when you start charging and tend to interrupt you. Outside of boss arenas, none of this is an issue. This means that often the in-between of boss fights can be a slightly slow chore of eliminating enemies, and sometimes the game decides to counteract this by throwing out more than one. And here is where you run into a whole host of other problems. Now, none of these are going to be surprising, but we have to talk about them. When you're dealing with multiple enemies, they come in different groupings. The least lethal but most annoying are groups of smaller enemies. They suffer from the lock-on system being garbage. Here's me trying to lock onto the thing that is obviously a threat because it's the only thing that can attack me, and the game refuses to do so, locking on to everything else in the area except the one thing I want to. And this is in a highly controlled environment with things standing still. So just imagine how this goes against 7 really fast opponents. The camera following suit can be terrible, getting stuck in walls or simply not zooming out enough, leading to you getting hit over and over again by enemies that you can't see, especially in areas with long-range enemies hidden away. Now let me mention that while I think the overall sound design, and especially the soundtrack in this game, is stellar, it really wants you to rely on sight in order to dodge attacks, since some of them are borderline unreactable with vision, and even more unreactable only with sound. It doesn't even feature indicators on the screen or some way of warning you like God of War Ragnarok does if you're being attacked by somebody you cannot see. In this game, you're simply in that situation and you're gonna get hit. And when this gets bad, it's infuriating. Like here, where I'm fighting about 14 enemies, most of which fly from one side of the room to another, and also a bunch of smaller worms that like to smack you around. This combination of the camera going everywhere, the game failing to switch targets, all while I'm getting hit, is pretty much as bad as it gets. Although there are some duo bosses later on where your camera also flails wildly and locks onto the other when one of them disappears, disorienting you. And on top of that, the one that disappeared attacks you when reappearing and doesn't tell you. Now you might say that I should just not lock on, which would be a sensible thing to do, and something that many Souls veterans are used to. But that doesn't work in Wukong. Now this might be me, but directing attacks without lock-on is a disaster. This is mostly because of its reliance on tracking for your attacks, and pretty poor tracking at that, since it even fails in one-on-one duels. When you're not locked on, each attack will have you practically standing still, and when you are locked on, every attack does move a decent distance towards enemies. Especially your combo finisher and your heavy attacks travel quite a bit in order to hit them, and that is gone when you're not locked on, leading to a lot of situations where your most important attacks just whiff. But they can also whiff when you're locked on. There's nothing worse than charging up a level 3 slam and you doing your very long, cool animation and then striking just next to the enemy that you're locked onto, even if you were already next to them. And this is probably due to some issues with how the lock-on tracking works and what it designates as the thing that you should hit. And I can confidently say that anybody who has played this game has whiffed charge attacks that should have never whiffed. And it feels terrible to have a combat system based around building up to this one big attack and have it miss through what feels like no fault of your own. And no, I'm not talking about some of the enemies that can dodge that big heavy attack. It's just normal mobs that move 2 centimeters and suddenly you slam the air. And this is where it's good that the game isn't that demanding for its combat. It isn't that difficult in my humble opinion and does offer many ways to exploit opponents, because if that weren't the case, between the tracking, the camera, and some of the performance issues that I hope will get ironed out over time, it would make a lot of the fights insufferable. Now that was a pretty long tangent from where we were, which was mobs, but let's rewind back to that and talk about the other option, which are mini-bosses and stronger enemies with other enemies. And these options suffer from all the problems from before, although at least they can be more exciting. But also more infuriating because now there's enemies that pose an actual threat. When the game does decide to add a mini-boss or a stronger enemy that is surrounded by smaller enemies, the smaller enemies can get you staggered and into an attack from that which can actually kill you. And when that happens from off the screen, or when the AI magically aligns to do things that are very difficult to get out of or to react to, well, you're gonna not have a good time. However, none of these things address the biggest problem, which is boredom. As you progress in the game, the segments traversing environments between the bosses become longer, and as you fight more and more mobs, the cracks start to show. Not only do we have the issues mentioned before, but the general resources you manage of mana and your focus and all that can be annoying to handle when most enemies don't require it. You don't need to use them. You'll use them on those bigger enemies that are more threatening, despite technically being mobs, or on the powered up versions of enemies that have spirits. But the fodder at the bottom of the pyramid are the ones that you fight the most. And these enemies, all you need are your basic attacks, your normal combos. You're just mashing square and sometimes triangle, that's all you need. There's no reason to use anything else, or to even switch stances in most cases, or anything at all. If you do struggle against the mobs, then sure, you'll find yourself using spells and other resources, but at that point I think the bosses will be a bit too hard. So I'd say for most players that are capable of finishing the game, the mobs are going to be very easy. And since they don't pose a threat nor a challenge, they become mindless, annoying button mashing that seems to exist to annoy you. Now keep in mind, this isn't something that ruins the game. This is not the meat of the game, but it is there, and it's not good. I think it's very poorly done compared to pretty much any other game or even genre that you want to compare it to. Be that Souls-likes or character action games that have tons of combos and weapons and in-depth mechanics that can make mobs feel like the practice rooms for pulling off sick combos, or the most direct one, which is God of War Ragnarok. where I think mobs and the general encounter design is made not just to be challenging, but to allow you to really show off the potential of the three weapons and how they can be used. Even when the fights don't require it, having so many options available means you can mash buttons and do some cool combos, and that keeps it at least engaging. But in Wukong, you have to go out of your way to spend unnecessary resources on enemies that don't matter, and I personally never did. Because if there was a mini-boss or something else around the corner, I wanted my mana and my chi to be available, and you just truly don't need to use them. I think we underestimate just how much value there is in variety and execution, no matter how meaningless it might be to the ultimate goal of making health bars go down. While God of War specifically introduced the Blades of Chaos as a tool for fighting against larger numbers, just the fact that you can switch to something that looks different or that you have to press different buttons in order to do different things makes what is otherwise mundane much more fresh for those willing to engage with it. There is of course a whole other conversation to have regarding how games use enemies to have players experiment with their tools and find the best ways to use them for each situation. As I said before, Wukong does this expertly with its many excellent bosses, but it doesn't have a lower tier of tools available mainly for the purpose of entertainment with which to deal with all of the mob enemies. But I like to call it the Dynasty Warriors effect, because even when the enemies don't require the specific use of tools, the fact that each character does the same thing but a little bit differently and with different combos and different areas of effect provides a lot of hours of entertainment. And if Wukong had given me a different weapon, or more appropriately a larger moveset to simply entertain myself with on the mindless mobs, I would have appreciated it, even if practically speaking it wouldn't change anything. I don't have to consider this a hypothetical because Wukong does indeed have an extra weapon. I don't have this marked as a spoiler because you can obtain 2 weapons in the game, and while one of them is very late into it, one is fairly early, and they do have the unique trait of incorporating spear moves into the moveset. Just this very tiny change to the rhythm of attacks when mashing the square button had a very profound impact in my enjoyment of the game, because it changed the entire feel of combat and the rhythms that accompany it. If instead of just this one very small change, the base moveset included a larger list of moves, and maybe I had 1 or 2 different, more meaningful variations, maybe even the stances that you can use for the staff, that each came with their own unique moves that more appropriately used the 2-button system and incorporated the heavy attacks in the game a bit more often and without thinking about spending the resource of focus points, I think that there would be a lot more to enjoy within the mobs, even if they're not great after it. And I'm not saying that I want this game to have more complex movesets because I actually want it to be Devil May Cry, or because I want it to be less of a Souls-like. I like the game for what it is, but what it is has problems, and that would be one of the easiest solutions to make that problem go away, or at least fade into the background a bit. And I think it's a pretty good summary of how I feel about many of the problems in Wukong, and you'll see this a lot later on as well. It's not the worst problem in the world, it doesn't ruin the game, but it does ruin a lot of moments of it. And with such an easy fix to it, it would be elevated so much compared to where it stands today. I don't heavily criticize it because I think it's bad. It's because I think it could be absolutely exceptional. I'm making the most out of the situation with that suggestion, but ideally you would have different enemies and different weapons or a more varied moveset with which you could take advantage of all of the mechanics that you add. But that never seemed to be the idea that Wukong was going for, so let's keep it at where it is. Now, if I were proposing something that isn't a band-aid solution, I would say that the game needs better enemies to form the mobs, a better sandbox. If you had enemies that required specific moves to take down or that had more clear weaknesses, along with more complex movesets, more options to take them down, that's how most combat sandboxes are made. Then you start to mix and match the different enemies and in different environments to keep variety very high, while still making it feel fun. At the current moment, the problem is that many of these enemies are just mashing square over and over again. And if they were a little bit more complicated, they required you using things like your cooldowns and your mana bar, which unless you're keeping topped up on medicines or have a very specific item, once it's over, it's over. And since the player never really knows when there could be a more difficult encounter around the corner, they would want to preserve that. And so, between the very frequent highlights that are pretty much every single boss in the game, you have these low points that can devolve into just mashing square over and over and over again. And I feel that with a little bit of tuning and a little bit of added complexity, instead of being low points, they could be just as high as the boss fights in most cases. So at the end of the day, these trash mob enemies can be so unbearably dull and unengaging that I would treat them like my relationship with my father, may God rest his soul, and just stand over there and let them hit me, mashing on the X button of my controller, waiting for it all to be over. I'm joking, by the way, my father is still alive. And it really comes down to the fact that mashing one button is not fun, especially after 30 hours. In bosses, you either need to or benefit greatly from spending your resources. And since so much of the game is centered on the timings and distances of enemies, mashing one button means that you're allowed to concentrate on what the opponent is doing, so it never feels boring. It feels like holding the beat while playing the drums, waiting for each bar to add in each flourish. But outside of bosses, it's reduced to waiting for the rest of the band to join in. With that out of the way, it could be much worse than having segments be unengaging or frustrating. Because you're still traversing this world, you're still managing your resources, and generally having a decent enough time at the worst of times. There's no terrible moment here, even if there are very frustrating ones. It's more about constant things that annoy, that pick at you slowly over time, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but that do leave a bad taste. It gets washed out at the next amazing boss, making the overall roller coaster ride of an adventure keep trucking along, but the moments it slows down still taste bad when you're in them. Wow, that was 3 horrible metaphors in one single sentence. I'm outdoing myself here. And speaking of outdoing oneself, the other major thing to discuss that equally holds plenty of great things and also sour spots is the exploration. And consistency is the name of the game here as well. Well, the name of the game is Black Myth Wukong, but you know what I'm saying. As I've mentioned before, Wukong is very linear in many ways, but it's also filled with secrets, optional content, and questlines. And how these two things are true at the same time is also one of my favorite things and one of the worst. Going off the beaten path, paying close attention to your surroundings, to small things, to NPCs, or just in general making sure you go everywhere the game allows you to go, will frequently have you end up in some sort of chain of events and locations and combat encounters that you'd otherwise miss. Sometimes all it takes to miss considerable amounts of content and bosses is to never go down the left path of a dark cave that's barely visible, while other times it's fairly involved little secrets reminiscent of From Software. Now, notice I said going off the beaten path is frequently rewarded, and that's because it sometimes isn't. And that in itself is fine. You need absence to make something special. What is sound without silence? But this is a game with constant invisible walls that limit where you can go, and the invisible part matters. Later on, once you discover enough secrets, you'll be jumping up tiny cliffs or trying to jump off of tiny steps everywhere you go, and you'll be met with invisible walls. Because if by some chance this one place is the one that you can jump onto, it probably leads to something cool. It's the new version of smacking every wall in Elden Ring, except it's actually the old version from PS2 games where you jumped against everything to see if you found a secret. This makes it especially strange when you can go somewhere that looks like you shouldn't, and there's nothing, making you paranoid that you're missing something and it'll matter later on. How what otherwise might be, well, the game has invisible walls, so what, is actually a bigger deal because sometimes it doesn't. And those moments hide some of the best parts of the game. When you're unsure what the rules are, it leads to a constant doubt and paranoia that everything is both an invisible wall and an invaluable secret at the same time. This doesn't change my stance on the secrets. I absolutely love the use of secrets and some of the surprises and how it rewards you for them. But at the same time, And yes, this is what I suspect will be the controversial part of this video. I think the level design on average is bad, and the visual design of the levels is terrible. So I'm not referring to how the levels look artistically, they can look incredible, but about how they interact with gameplay. For starters, it matters that each chapter can be summarized by its environment. Oh, this is a forest, this is a desert, this is a forest but snow, this is a forest but caves and spiders, and I generally like them, and they are very distinct from each other, but not distinct within themselves. Some of these chapters can turn into long stretches of the same color and the same assets until it becomes hard to distinguish where exactly I've been and where I'm going. While there can be some key landmarks that help orient yourself, sometimes right next to the landmarks are two very similar looking paths, both heading slightly down and lead into similar environments. And unless you're making mental notes of directions to locations, I think it's easy to make mistakes and head in the wrong direction for a while until you reorient yourself. Some areas are much worse than others, but there is a general feeling of sameness that made multiple locations blend together, and when heading back to clean up side quests in specific areas, navigating them was a lot harder than they needed to. This gets even worse by something I'm prepared to be an even more unpopular opinion, but I think Black Myth Wukong could do with some more signposting. The yellow paint epidemic has been an ongoing war in games for a while now, and I agree that it's a bit much. I believe that the yellow paint can be very useful and removes a lot of potential frustration in the design of some games, but sometimes it's overused and unnecessary. I advocate for games to keep yellow paint as an accessibility feature to turn on for those who need it, and try to implement other more organic ways of signposting, which plenty of games already do. Wukong does have some, be that platforms that clearly indicate you can jump off them, or the use of light to show the way forward, but there's not that much overall. In certain areas, I really enjoyed this. The temple in Chapter 3, for example, was something to organically explore in a cool way, where I would just run to each place and be surprised if it was or not a new mini area to explore. But there, the limitations are clear. There's big buildings, you walk up to them, maybe there's stuff, maybe there isn't. But in much larger environments that pretend to be huge but are sectioned off by invisible walls, which again is made worse by the secret hunting, I found myself frustrated running off in a direction with no indication if there would be a path or an invisible wall. And the results were more or less 50-50, so I had to keep doing it. I think the clearest example is Chapter 2 in the desert, where visual clarity was so mumbled that I couldn't find the shrines, which are the bonfires in this game. And I want to preface this by saying that I've been playing video games for a very long time, and I play a lot of video games currently. For many of my projects, I play a lot of older games from the PS1 and PS2 era mostly. I've dealt with all sorts of stuff, and I don't remember encountering this quite as badly anywhere else. Sure, there's games where the thing you're looking for is right in front of you and you were dumb, and other games that do indeed lack visual clarity for signposting, but look at these images here. When you're sprinting through an area and thinking, hey, there's a shrine around here for fast travel, right? But the game is in movement and the shrine and its smoke mixes with everything else, which is more or less the same tone, it's really easy to miss it, even when looking for it. I can't imagine this if you put motion blur on top of it all. There's a small prompt when you're close to it, but even that can get lost in the shuffle since it's tiny. All that was really needed was to make the smoke a contrasting color with the environment, or add some slight shading and outline to either the shrine or its effects to make it stand out. And it might sound like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but the same issue is repeated throughout the game in many other things. From chests made of wood that camouflage within the trees, to tiny ornate offerings that house upgrades, when there's also some similar altars that house nothing. And of course, the paths we're meant to follow and where we can and can't go. And it's not consistent. Look at the shrines in Chapter 4. I suppose that because they're initially covered in webs like much of the environment, which is a neat touch, along with the animation when activating them, here, the placement of the shrines and the smoke effect makes them stand out visually much more. They're framed in a way that the area in which they're in, there tends to be some very clearly visible fire to contrast with some of the darkness, or they're placed in an area where the only thing there is the shrine, instead of being directly next to two different paths and some enemies. When you combine all of this with the invisible walls from before, Sometimes, the visual information you get while exploring is just a clumsy mess that detracts from an experience that otherwise is at its best when it keeps you moving. Sure, it wants you to explore and find secrets, but I think getting lost during that process can severely harm the pacing of the game more than it already is by default. It's a constant give and take with this game. There is so much excellence, marred by these small problems that are impactful in my opinion. It's like that scene in The Departed. These aren't problems that sink the ship, but they aren't quite problems that don't sink the ship, you know? Wicked stuff, something Boston. But overall, with those small gripes slowly grinding away in the background, exploration is fun because the secret encounters and rewards for exploring are great. And even when it's locked behind the more constrained spaces, it works more often than not. But what does hurt a lot is pacing. I hope I made it clear before, but I believe the intention of Wukong is in its roller coaster aspirations. And it's true, it doesn't waste the player's time, but boy can it still screw up its pacing. To be fair, there's many ways of considering this, because I did a fairly thorough run towards the secret ending, and others might ignore all the optional things and have a better experience, although still flawed. Having said that, every optional area is designed to be done the moment you encounter it, not after. Since you'd return so overpowered, it'll lose its purpose. So there is an intended pacing in my playthrough. Add on to this that I think different people will get stuck on different bosses depending on their playstyle and personal preferences, but even with all of that, the game overall can slog. Mostly because of the chapter structure. Largely speaking, every chapter works a bit as an independent story as the Destined One deals with whoever has the relic for the chapter, and the resolution of those conflicts give insight into each region and each major character of the chapters, with some key characters like Baji moving over from chapter 3 onwards. It's excellent in that sense, leading to a sense of closure that's highly enjoyable upon each chapter's end. But because of this, with some exceptions, each chapter is a single biome, making them visually a real slog that just seems to go on without much change. Chapter 1 is short enough and Chapter 2 is much larger, leading to the first time you might tire of the sandy desert, but the obscenely long Chapter 3 and its snow will always stand out. This is partially because Chapter 3 doesn't have a secret area to uncover, instead housing the real final boss once you reach the end. This means that in every other chapter, you can tack on an hour or two of extra time if you're doing the optional segments. But in Chapter 3, by force, you will spend 2 to 3 more hours than any other chapter, even if you had done the secrets. It's also the only chapter with one very large visual change to break it up, but it comes fairly early on in the chapter and then spirals into mountains of snow and temples for a long time, and has some of the larger quote-unquote open areas in the game where you can just feel like rocks, trees, snow, and then things like the temple. And I really want to compare it to Chapter 4 because that does a much better job. It's also my favorite chapter of the game, but it is going to help me explain my point in why these chapters can feel like this. So while Chapter 4 has my personal favorite story in it, the important part is how it visually marks what you're meant to do. In general, all throughout Chapter 4, you're descending a mountain, but through valleys and caves inside it, alternating from the dark and damp to luscious greens. This already provides much more diversity compared to most other chapters, but it's the sense of heading towards a goal and the verticality that constantly reminds you of it. You see, it's not just that many areas are visually similar in this game, but how often you feel like the right direction isn't very clear. This is something that many great games do very subtly. You will have a clear objective in the distance, and a general sense of what it will take to reach that objective. And in Wukong, for as much as there might be big set pieces for a chapter, big areas for you to explore, you will reach them, you will do them, you will be unsure of where you're headed, and then you will also sometimes be magically teleported or turn into a bird and fly somewhere else. And then you're dropped into an area that looks visually the same as the one you were in before the set piece. This harms pacing a ton because the drive, the sense of reaching a goal, is gone. You're wandering forward down linear hallways while hunting for the ones that aren't. unsure of what you're even looking for, guided by the big glowing monster at the end, but never sure if that's even the right way. By not having clear goals, the drive and motivation can dissipate, because after a long while of traversing the same environments, you don't think, we almost reached the place we're headed to, I'm gonna keep playing the game. And instead you think, holy, when does this end? Where are we even headed to? I should take a break, man, I'm tired, I've been fighting spiders for like 2 hours. And while no chapter is truly good at this, at least Chapter 4 establishes its overall goal of descending and slightly accentuates it visually with the spiders to keep you a bit more motivated. Not showing the player the end goal can harm the journey, because the journey is what matters most in life. But as a player, we need a reason to embark on it. And as I've said, despite however many comments will appear under this video saying that it sounds like I hate this game, I will take all of these downsides. I will take the game as it is. Oh, you want me to just wander? Is this some sort of metaphor that you want to present? Or is it just that you hadn't considered this part of the game when designing it? Well, I don't care, because the overall experience that I'm having is good. We're dissecting a lot of the low points of a game that is very focused on the extremely high points that I highlighted at the start of this video. But even within these low points, it is so rare for a game to offer this amount of secrets, and to have these secrets hide meaningful content, some of the best in the game, along with important things that can change how you play the game moving forward. That is a sense of reward for somebody willing to explore that is almost never seen anymore in video games. And if unfortunately the way that it's implemented here has a number of shortcomings, it doesn't take away that the overall execution of it, the most important part of it, which is why I would want to even do it in the first place, is absolutely nailed and drilled into the player from very early on, from Chapter 1. So I will take what I can get, but the truth is I would like to take it without also getting punched in the face from time to time. This is truly a case where a combination of different elements, being primarily a better guided experience as to where you're headed from a visual perspective, along with a little more curation, a little bit more variety, and for as much detail as this game has in so many aspects that we're going to get into in a moment, some more of it paid to the environment would have helped a lot in removing some of these sour spots. And now finally, we're heading into spoiler territory. It's a fairly short section, but I have to warn you anyways. And I have to start off the spoiler section by mentioning that I think this game gets better the further in you go. That might sound obvious, but it isn't the case with many games. Chapter 5 might suffer from some of the same problems as many others, but it houses two of the most visually spectacular bosses in the game and a couple of set pieces that stand out. But the most important part of this is Chapter 6, where you obtain the Somersault Cloud. This tiny slice of open world with a bit of optional content and 3 main bosses plus a stat check really is a moment for the game to spread its wings, try something different, empower the player, and send you off in a gauntlet of spectacle. It's also where I think most people will turn back to finish off side quests and secrets. Each chapter, except for the 6th one, has a secret area with a secret boss and a reward. Chapter 6 contains a number of smaller areas that you can explore in this pseudo-open world. But once you've completed the secret parts of every other chapter that isn't 6, you can head back to Chapter 3. And upon entering the pagoda, you can then fight Erlang Shen. This is the hardest fight in the game in my opinion, and also the most spectacular. And I respect this massively. To hide the best part of the entire game behind a long list of optional secret content, and for it to be so incredible as to outdo the surprise of Chapter 6, requires true dedication. You know that most players won't ever fight Erlang, but they put the effort into all of it just the same. You can also enter this area after finishing the base story, but I think it flows better with him before. And this is truly an astonishing fight that I think stands out way more than what is the normal ending of the game. But it's a combination of everything why Wukong shines the brightest at the end. It rids itself of the parts of the game that aren't quite as shiny. The open world section use visual markers remarkably well to guide players, and the gauntlet of bosses is what the game does best, with each being a visual feast and mechanical challenge. The freedom and more open sense of exploration of the area with its different secrets to find while flying around offers a fantastic change of pace, with little to no filler in terms of combat between those bosses. Once you have all of the different options available to you to kit out your perfect loadout for each fight, you can really get into the weeds as the game challenges you with each one. It also leans heavy into its story, which is one that, even for those unfamiliar with the source material, is powerful in the way it's told. I normally leave a lot of the story stuff outside of my reviews because I'm not that good with that sort of stuff. I think there's plenty of people that do better jobs than I ever could. And while I think a lot of the stories here and the overall story is very interesting, although something we've seen before in a sense, never in this context, but a lot of the larger themes that it wants to communicate have been done before, I think it's the fact that the cinematography, the script, the localization, all of it was so carefully done that it kept me engaged all the way through and was a big motivating factor for me to reach the end. But now I really want to talk about that secret final boss, and how amazing the fight can be and how much fun it is. How it really doesn't mind giving you a final reward that doesn't require perfect execution after Erlong. It just says, hey, you did it. Now it's time for you to enjoy. And it goes absolutely bananas, pun intended. And the final spectacular sequence, which is so incredibly well done that it will live on in my memory for a while, to the same degree as the best moments in God of War. There's many other specifics that I could go into of the game, from the yin-yang fight in Chapter 5, or the setting of the final battle, and yes, the Mantis is also very cool. And of course, Rakshasa is just amazing. It's a fight that's on Metal Gear Revengeance levels, but I think I've laid out quite well enough just how spectacular the game can be, and how it keeps its creativity up throughout. It really uses this carefully made combat system to fulfill everything that it could. And then I could also highlight some of the worst areas, which again, are never really related to the actual boss fighting. The pagoda in Chapter 3 with its ganks and instant death pits, or some parts of Chapter 4, or how the rolling ball in Chapter 5 is both very well done and very annoying, along with the magma, especially for people who didn't pick up the fireproof mantle in Chapter 1. But I think I've done enough yapping by now. It's truly a final 4-hour stretch, once you reach Chapter 6, and depending on where you place the secret boss, that's worth the price of admission alone. And it finished a lot stronger than it started. And if you're somehow listening to this, and you drop the game midway through or something, please keep at it. It's worth it. And ultimately, it's high points like this very long one at the end of the game make it an overall triumph. A very flawed masterpiece. But that portion of Chapter 6 also illuminated the potential and the hopes I have for Game Science, the studio behind Wukong. Seeing the scope presented here the first time you jump on the cloud, and imagining a version of this game with a world more player-minded in how you explore it, one with just a tad bit more options, but overall just bigger and grander and more. Because after 40 hours of my first playthrough and an extra 15 on my second, I wanted more. I wanted grander adventures and beautiful stories. I wanted more foes to face down and more unique chapter cutscenes. I wanted to continue exploring this combat system and its limitations, and it would be even better if it were broken into a whole new tier later on. I was ready for 4 more chapters with the game as it is, but in a world where a sequel addresses my concerns, I couldn't stop talking about this game for years. And this is why I think your overall reception to this game can vary. Many people will connect with its artistic sensibilities, with the love and care and dedication poured into it, with just the absurd number of bosses and how each of them is designed and interacts with the systems in the game. How it nails what it wants to do. And they will come away like me wanting more. While others might come away more affected by its shortcomings and fail to see the hype. I think many of those people in the second camp aren't expressing what bothers them correctly, because some just wanted this game to be something different, and others are getting rightfully turned away by issues in parts of the game that they might value more than others, and that includes the game that very clearly places its priorities on its bosses. But there is a game here that can resonate and inspire, that conjured a vision in my head of a game even better than this one. And this is one that I truly love. I hope that at the end of the day, what you can take from this game is all the good, and that the Destined One's journey to the West is something that not only reaches you, but fills you with joy. It comes with a lot of small problems, that overall, when you look at this video and how much of it are those problems, you start to realize how they can mount and become much more than what they seem in each individual instance. But this is not a case of death by 1,000 cuts, because the high points stand so much higher than everything else. I think it's a trope to say, oh, what the game does well, it does very well, but very few games do what Black Myth Wukong does well in the same stratosphere. There is careful consideration to almost everything in this game, except all of the things that it doesn't, which are the ones that I keep complaining about. And even those that are bad are much better than in many other games, because it's all surrounded by some exceptional stuff. I can't wait to see what comes next. I've been Mug, thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video was entertaining, was informative, and I guess I hope the video did what it was supposed to do. Talk about a game, its very big pros, and its very large number of cons. A very special thanks to the people up on the $1 patron wall. It's called that way because there's only one tier, $1. But a huge thanks to Mika, Islar, Kite Jr., Alf, Fluffy, Alex, Some Dude, Rap ID Ralph, RF, Justin, Noria, Alfred, Willie Best, Yappy Beast Frog, Tushar, Hunter, Dodger, Zedworth, Kakper, BD Unico, Anthony I, and Psycho Cake. If I somehow miss somebody, or you want me to change your name or pronounce it correctly, just let me know in the Discord server, which is opening up to everybody so that we can organize some cool community stuff over there. And you can access the Discord from the Patreon. You don't need to be a member to join the Discord, like I said. I'm not a very social person in general, but I'm doing my best to try and create a community of people who love video games and want to share them with everyone. I don't think it's legal to make a YouTube video without at some point saying, hey, please like and please subscribe. So I have to say that and then tell you, I've been Mug Thief. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.